על המלך טוי, אם על המלך טוב בואי, תינוסן לי, נפשי בשילוסי. אם על המלך טוי, אם על המלך טוב בואי, תינוסן לי, נפשי בשילוסי. אם מוצא שיחין בעינךו המלך, אם מוצא שיחין בעינךו המלך, תינוסן לי, נפשי בשילוסי, וימי בבקושי, אם מוצא שיחין בעינךו.
Hello everyone. One of the questions that come up this year, which is unique for this year, is the following question. Is reading in Yerushalayim considered early or on time? Now, that may sound like a rhetorical question, because at the end of the day, even the residents of Yerushalayim will read the Megillah on the 14th, namely tonight and tomorrow, and therefore, who cares if we considered it early or late? But as we will see, it has ramifications. And the reason it has ramifications is because of the source on the top of the page. In Masechet Megillah Daf Hey Amud Aleph, Amar Rav, and this is the way we paskin, unlike Rav Asi that says you always need a minyan for Megillah reading, Rav says, Bizmana, if you read it on time, you don't need a minyan. Only if you read it early, like the first Mishnah in Megillah, where the small villages used to read it from the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, but way before the 14th, during the month of Adar, then you need a minyan. But on the 14th, you do not need a minyan. From this perspective, the question is, the residents of Yerushalayim are supposed to read it on the 15th, but they're reading it a day early on the 14th. If it's considered bizmana, then indeed, they don't need a minyan. You can read it even without a minyan. But if it's not considered bizmana, then they do need a minyan. So from this perspective, this has a big ramification for Yerushalayim. Can you read without a minyan in the room? Rashi on this Gemara, as you can see on the source sheet, says that the word shelo bizmana, not on time, means kegon kfarim hamakdimim liyom haknisa. It means the small villages that used to read on the 11th, on the 12th, etc. But it does not mean the residents of Yerushalayim that are going to read on the 14th. Indeed, if you look at the Yerushalmi in Maseches Megillah, it seems clear that the Yerushalmi at least contemplates that any time you read it early, you would go ahead and actually need a minyan, but then takes it back. And the conclusion of the Yerushalmi is Kol shamru yidachel liyom haknisa ubilvad b'asara, that indeed only when you read on the 11th, on the 12th, on the 13th of Adar, then you need a minyan. But if you read it on the 14th, you would not need a minyan. Since the residents of Yerushalayim are reading it on the 14th, and there is, as Rashi says, the ba'inan pirsum hanes, the reason that you need a minyan is to publicize the miracle on days in which you usually don't read the Megillah. Since everyone's reading that day, Tel Aviv, through Yerushalayim and around the world, there is pirsum hanes, and therefore you don't need a minyan according to Rashi. This is also probably what the Rambam means when the Rambam says, "V'chol elu shemagdivim v'korin kodem ba'asar en korin otabu pachot ba'asara." Whoever reads before the 14th needs a minyan. But if you read it on the 14th, then you don't need a minyan. From this perspective, the Or Sameach, Rav Meir Simcha Midvinsk, indeed is medayek from the Rambam, and I quote his words, that mukafin shekorin b'yudalit, people of Yerushalayim that are going to read this year on the 14th, since he says korin afilu b'yachid, you can even read it actually without a minyan. In other words, whoever reads before the 14th, that's shelo bizmana, that's early, and they need a minyan. But if you read it on the 14th, as will the residents of Yerushalayim this year, there is no problem, and you are allowed to read it even without a minyan, and of course, with a bracha. The one who disagrees is the Ran. The Ran says that the word shelo bizmana means exactly this year. Hainu keshechal yodal livnei ayarot b'Shabbat or tedvav livnei krachin shemagdimim v'korin be'erev Shabbat. And indeed, the Ritva, at least in the name of the Acherim, agrees with this perush, namely, shelo bizmana, not on time, means when you read not on the day you're supposed to, but a day early, regardless if that day is the 14th or not. And therefore, the residents of Yerushalayim this year are reading a Megillah Shelo Bizmana, are reading a Megillah early. And because they're reading the Megillah early, they would require a minyan. Without a minyan, they will not be able to read the Megillah, at least with a bracha. So it's a machloket between the Rashi and the Ran, or between the Rambam and the Ritva. How do we paskin? Is it considered early or not? On this question, indeed, there is a very big machlokes between the Chazon Ish, Rav Zonenfeld on the one hand, and the Mishnah Berurah on the other. As surprising as it sounds, the Mishnah Berurah actually paskins like the Ran and like the Ritva in two different places, as you can see here on the left side of the page. The Mishnah Berurah says explicitly that ultimately, Krachina Mukafin Choma, such as Yerushalayim, who has a wall around it, the Matrime Yom Tetvav Shalahen B'Shabbat, when the 15th comes out on Shabbos, the Korinoto Be'erev Shabbat, and they read it a day early on Erev Shabbos on Friday, and if you read it without a minyan, you can make its brachos because it's considered early, and therefore the only way you can make brachot on the Megillah is if you read it with a minyan. And he repeats this in two different places in Simon Taf Reish Tzadik, in Seif Katan Samech Aleph and Seif Katan Samech Vav. He makes it very clear, I paskin like the Ran. The Pnei Yoshua, at least in his Perush on the Gemara, seems to say that this is sort of a lo pluk. In other words, even though the 14th has Persume Nisa anyway, since most of the world is celebrating Purim. And from this perspective, there's really no need for a minyan. Since this is what our sage has said, it would also apply to Yerushalayim, who's reading on the 14th. So, on the one hand, he doesn't necessarily consider it early, but his conclusion is very much like the Mishnah Berurah. Namely, you need a minyan this year to read the Megillah. Now, why is this important? Most people do go to shul anyway. The answer is what we call the women's Megillah reading. If women who are obligated in Megillah read for women, the question is if in Yerushalayim that can happen this year. According to the simple reading of the Mishnah Berurah, based on the Ran and the Ritva, it's an early reading, and therefore they need a minyan. If they need a minyan, then if there's going to be a minyan, they can read it. But if it's a women's Megillah reading, women for women, it will not be possible in Yerushalayim. But the Chazon Ish actually totally disagrees with the Mishnah Berurah. And he actually brings three different reasons why this year in Yerushalayim it is considered fine to read the Megillah without a minyan. Now, once again, we always look for a minyan. That's the halacha. But if there isn't a minyan, you can read it and with its brachot, even in Yerushalayim. Number one, he says, Rashi is correct. Shelo Bizmana does not mean reading it on the 14th. It means reading it earlier than the 14th. Number two, he says, very, very explicitly, that ultimately having a minyan is not li'ikuva, meaning it's the right thing to do, but at the end of the day, you can make brachot even if you read it early and even without a minyan. And number three, he says that there's a Ramah. The Ramah says something very interesting, that even if you need a minyan, and you should look for a minyan, says the Ramah, and I quote his words here, the Ramah says, "V'yesh lihistapek im nashim mitzdarfot la'asara." The minyan needed, maybe women, can be counted for, since they're obligated in reading Megillah. Then what's the difference? If all we need is Pirsum Hanes, publicizing the miracle, we don't need to have exactly 10 men over bar mitzvah. You can also have women in the room. And from this perspective, there would be no problem to have a minyan of, quote unquote, minyan of women reading for women, because there is Pirsum Hanes. There's more than 10 women there. From this perspective, says the Chazon Ish, for these three reasons. Number one, the minyan is not li'ikuva. Number two, probably Rashi and the Rambam are correct. And number three, maybe women are part of the minyan anyway. He adds another thing. and that is the following. ומה שכתב הרמ"א דיחיד שלא שמע אין צריך 10, כיוון דכבר נתפרסם הקריאה 10 בציבור, נראה גם כן שלא בזמנו הדין כן. Comes along the Ramah with an interesting chiddush, and the Ramah says that the whole requirement for a minyan is only if there wasn't a minyan in town that already read. But once the minyan in town read, let's say the 7 o'clock minyan read, then afterwards, from 8 o'clock on, you can have Megillah readings without a minyan. That's what the Ramah says. I quote his words. The Imkaru al Tabet Tzibur, says the Ramah. The Ezi Achid lo Shama'a. Namely, there was a 7 o'clock minyan and you weren't there. Yuchad likrotaf ilu lechatchila b'yachid. Ho'il v'korin otam ba'oto ha'ir ba'asara. So basically, for these 4 reasons, the Chazon Ish says that even a women's Megillah reading for women this year would be fine. Number 1, it's not li'ikuva to have a minyan. Number 2, Rashi and the Rambam are probably correct. Number 3, maybe women can be part of the minyan. And number 4, there are minyanim in Yerushalayim galore. So once there's minyanim, then even you who can't get to the minyan can read it by yourself. The one who agrees with him is Rav Sonnenfeld. Rav Sonnenfeld, I don't think anyone will think he was a big lover of, let's say, the religious Zionist community. But on this particular issue, he makes it very, very clear that ultimately, since our sages said that if Purim comes out on Shabbos, you read the Megillah a day early, the whole reason why we have to have a minyan if we read it early is because no one else is reading it but your little village. But in this case, the whole Yerushalayim is reading it. And therefore, from this perspective, he agrees with the Chazon Ish, and he says that this year is not considered an early reading, it's considered a reading on time. And therefore, says Rav Sonnenfeld, if it's a reading on time, it's like every year. So if you have a women's Megillah reading read by women, it would be as fine this year as any other year. And he adds that in a sefer called Bnei Binyamin, that at the end of which are the Minhagim of Yerushalayim, it makes it very clear that even someone who can't get to shul can indeed make a bracha. So indeed, it seems from the Chazon Ish and Rav Sonnenfeld, unlike the Mishnah Berurah, that if you can't get to shul in Yerushalayim tonight or tomorrow, you can make a bracha and read the Megillah for yourself, like every year. The Mishnah Berurah disagrees, and he says, no, this year is considered an early reading, and if you're going to read it alone, don't make the brachot. That would also cancel out the ability of a women's Megillah reading by women. To make a long story very, very short, as you can all see, defining the Megillah reading in Yerushalayim this year as early or on time would have ramifications for 2 things. Number 1, can you have a women's Megillah reading by women? Number 2, can someone who can't get to shul have to read the Megillah and with its brachot or not? So ultimately, this is a very, very important question that has to be paskined. I would think that at the end of the day, I have not seen anyone, except for the Gris Soloveitchik, who was machmir on this question. And this year in Yerushalayim, they will basically act like they do every year regarding Megillah reading. The Gris Soloveitchik said that this year indeed is an early reading. We should be choshesh for the Ran, the Ritva, and the Mishnah Berurah, and therefore, even though on a regular year, if you have a klaf, if you have a real Megillah, it's better that you read it yourself, even within the minyan, because mitzvah bo, yoter mi bishlucho, it's a bigger mitzvah for you than to do it through a messenger. This year, says the Gris Soloveitchik, since you need to hear it via the minyan, it's an early reading, you shouldn't read along with the Baal Koreh in Yerushalayim. But ultimately, outside of the Gris Soloveitchik, I believe Rov HaPoskim disagree, and I think Rav Ovadia Yosef says it great, and we'll end with his words. Shahikar de bnei korachim shemakdimim likrot b'yudalit chashiv shaper bizmana be'ein sarich asara. At the end of the day, it seems clear that this year is not an early reading. It's considered reading on time for Yerushalayim, and therefore you do not need a minyan. And he says that's the halacha lemaaseh that he paskin. So paskin Rav Tikochinsky, who was a resident of Yerushalayim, and kvar pashat minhag came. And even though Rav Ovadia Yosef is very, very, very worried about brachot levatala, on this particular issue, he says, and I quote, "Ve'ein bezeh kol chashash l'safek brachot." There is no problem whatsoever to be worried about making a bracha. So at the end of the day, I believe that this year, indeed, Yerushalayim is considered reading on time, and therefore you can read it like every year. If you can't get to shul, you can read it with his brachot. And if there's a women's Megillah reading by women, then they too can go ahead and make brachot. If you want to be choshesh to the Mishnah Berurah based on the Ran and the Ritva, then of course you have to make it your business to only read it with a minyan, and that might cancel out the women's reading by women, unless you want to rely on the Ramah that we quoted earlier that said that indeed maybe on this issue women are counted for a minyan. But as I said earlier, I believe this year in Yerushalayim, they are going to act with Megillah reading like every other year. That seems to be the minhag. That seems to be Rov HaPoskim. And indeed, I wish everyone a very significant and useful fast and a very happy Purim, despite all that's happening around us, and despite the very sophisticated year that we have, in which Purim comes out on Friday for some, and then on Shabbos for the residents of Yerushalayim.
Medina,